The cobblestones of Weatherfield have long held secrets buried deep beneath their dark, rain-slicked surfaces, but few mysteries have fractured the community quite like the sudden, violent death of Theo Silverton. For 13 agonizing months, Theo had cast a long, suffocating shadow over the street, inflicting a relentless campaign of physical and psychological abuse upon his partner, Todd Grimshaw. When Todd finally found the courage to report his husband to the police, the fragile clock began ticking toward an inevitable, explosive conclusion. By the time April arrived, bringing with it a deceptive spring chill, the abuse had reached a breaking point, culminating in the horrific discovery of Theo's lifeless body at a construction site. It was Betsy Swain who stumbled upon the grim scene on the very night her mother, DS Lisa Connor Swain, was celebrating her wedding to Carla Connor. What followed was a complex web of deceit that entangled half the neighborhood, sending shockwaves through the Platt and Windass families and leaving the local police department scrambling for answers while the real culprit walked free, masked by a perfectly timed alibi. In the immediate wake of the murder, the investigation launched by DS Lisa Connor Swain and DC Kit Green focused heavily on a hand-picked group of prime suspects, each possessing a deeply personal motive to want Theo gone. Todd Grimshaw stood at the center of the storm, a broken man who had endured the worst of Theo's malice and whose missing mobile phone had mysteriously found its way into the hands of a local teenager named Brody. Alongside Todd stood George Shuttleworth, whose protective instincts had often flared dangerously, and Summer Spellman, whose fierce loyalty to Todd made her vulnerable to intense police scrutiny. The suspect pool was further complicated by Christina Boyd, Gary Windass, and Theo's deeply bitter ex-wife, Danielle Silverton. For weeks, the police chased shadows, even going so far as to briefly arrest Summer, a move that left a lingering bitter taste in the mouths of her family and fueled a growing sense of injustice on the street. Yet, while the detectives methodically picked apart the lives of the official six, the true architect of Theo's fatal plunge remained hidden in plain sight, drowning in a sea of unspoken guilt while trying to maintain the facade of a normal life. The turning point came during what was supposed to be a celebratory evening, an intimate dinner party arranged by Kit Green with the secret intention of proposing to his partner, Sarah Platt. Held against a backdrop of simmering neighborhood tensions, the gathering quickly deteriorated from an awkward social obligation into a psychological pressure cooker. Gathered around the table were Kit, Sarah, Gary Windass, Maria Connor, Summer, and Todd, an volatile combination of personalities bound together by unspoken suspicions. The atmosphere grew heavy as Maria, increasingly paranoid over recent secretive behavior, openly voiced her suspicions that Gary and Sarah were rekindling their past romance and engaging in a clandestine affair. Kit, meanwhile, remained utterly convinced that Gary was the man responsible for Theo's death, using his position at the table to subtly probe and needle the builder. As the accusations flew and the emotional temperature in the room soared to a boiling point, the narrative fractured, plunging the audience into a series of visceral, haunting flashbacks that shattered weeks of carefully constructed lies. The truth, when it finally unmasked itself, was far more shocking than anyone on the street could have anticipated, revealing that Sarah Platt was the one who had ended Theo Silverton's life. Through the vivid clarity of the flashbacks, the events of that fateful April night were laid bare, stripping away the red herring of Sarah's subsequent attack by Jody Ramsey, which had served as her perfect, albeit accidental, shield. On the night of the murder, a desperate Sarah had gone out searching for Todd, dialing his number only to hear his phone ringing high up on the cold metal scaffolding of the local building site. Climbing into the shadows, she did not find Todd, but instead confronted a heavily intoxicated and deeply unstable Theo. When Sarah attempted to leave, Theo blocked her path, his demeanor turning profoundly sinister as he leveled chilling threats against her. Hearing him speak of Todd in the past tense, Sarah was seized by the terrifying conviction that Theo had already murdered her best friend, a fear that transformed into sheer panic when Theo moved toward her, vowing that what he could do to her would pale in comparison to what he had done to his husband. In that fleeting, terrifying pocket of time, Sarah operated entirely on the primitive instinct of self-preservation, convinced that she was locked in a literal life-or-death struggle. As Theo advanced, she fiercely shoved him backward, but the aggressive builder refused to back down, sneering that she would deeply regret her defiance. Terrified and seeing no other escape route from the narrow, dangerous platform, Sarah's hands found a heavy metal pole left behind by the workman. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, she swung the weapon, striking Theo squarely over the head with a sickening crack. The force of the blow sent him staggering backward, losing his footing on the slick edge before plunging over the side of the scaffolding, falling through the darkness to the unforgiving ground below. Standing alone in the howling wind, Sarah looked over the edge at his motionless form, her mind fracturing into a state of absolute numbness and blinding panic as the reality of what she had just done crashed over her. Unable to process the gravity of her actions and too terrified to call her detective boyfriend, Kit, for fear that his professional duty would override his love for her, Sarah turned to the one man she knew could handle the darkness. A single, frantic phone call brought Gary Windass rushing to the scene, where he found a hysterical Sarah trembling beside the corpse. Bound by their complicated history and a fierce desire to protect the mother of his child, Gary immediately took control of the situation, orchestrating a hasty cover-up and vowing to keep the secret buried forever. This shared trauma became the foundation of their recent, cryptic interactions, the very behavior that Maria had misinterpreted as a sordid affair. Back in the present day, as the dinner party crumbled around them, Sarah sat in agonizing silence, the weight of the flashbacks pressing down on her chest while Kit continued his relentless pursuit of Gary. The irony hung suffocatingly heavy over the room, with a dedicated police officer unknowingly planning a future with the very killer he had sworn to bring to justice, completely oblivious to the fact that the enemy was sitting right beside him, holding his hand. The shattering of illusions at the dinner party set into motion a rapid, devastating chain of events that would ultimately lead to Sarah Platt's ruin. Following the tense gathering, Kit Green's professional instincts began to clash violently with his personal life. Though he had spent weeks aggressively pursuing Gary Windass as his prime suspect, the erratic behavior, subtle slips in conversation, and sheer emotional exhaustion displayed by Sarah began to paint a far more disturbing picture. Kit, an astute detective who prided himself on reading people, could no longer ignore the glaring discrepancies in Sarah's timeline from the night of Theo's murder. The realization hit him not with a sudden explosion of evidence, but with a slow, sickening dread as he re-examined the call logs and the forensic data from the construction site scaffolding. The puzzle pieces, which had previously seemed warped and ill-fitting, suddenly aligned perfectly when Sarah was placed at the center of the frame. The heavy metal pole used to strike Theo, the timing of her frantic calls, and her desperate reliance on Gary all pointed to a truth Kit had been too blinded by love to see. Driven by a mix of heartbreak and professional duty, Kit quietly initiated a covert review of the evidence, bypassing standard department channels to avoid alerting his colleagues. He knew that an accusation of this magnitude against his own partner, the mother of Harry Platt, would tear the community apart and potentially destroy his own career if handled improperly. His turning point came when a fresh forensic sweep of the scaffolding, ordered under the guise of tying up loose ends regarding Gary, returned a microscopic trace of material that matched a jacket Sarah had worn on that fateful April night. It was the definitive, undeniable proof he had feared. The woman he loved, the woman he had intended to marry, was the person who had sent Theo Silverton plunging to his death. For Kit, the betrayal was multi-layered. She had not only committed a homicide, but she had also sat across from him for months, watching him obsess over the case and allowing innocent people like Summer Spellman to face intense police scrutiny without uttering a word. The arrest itself was orchestrated with a clinical, agonizing precision that contrasted sharply with the chaotic passion of the crime. Kit chose to confront Sarah at the Platt household, a place usually synonymous with noisy family gatherings and domestic warmth. Stepping through the door, his face was a mask of cold, professional detachment, a stark contrast to the affectionate partner Sarah had grown dependent on. The air in the living room grew instantly static as Kit requested that Gail and Audrey step out, leaving him alone with a visibly trembling Sarah. When he formally uttered the words of the caution, arresting her on suspicion of the murder of Theo Silverton, the fragile facade Sarah had maintained for over a year completely shattered. She didn't fight. Instead, a hollow, breathless gasp escaped her as the sheer weight of her hidden guilt caught up with her. The clicks of the metal handcuffs sealing around her wrists echoed through the quiet house like a death knell, signaling the end of her freedom and the beginning of a public nightmare. As Sarah was led out of the house and into the rear of a waiting police vehicle, the Coronation Street community watched in absolute, paralyzed disbelief. The news spread through the tightly knit neighborhood like wildfire, crossing from the Rovers' return to the factory floor within minutes. David Platt was entirely beside himself with rage and disbelief, loudly accusing Kit of abusing his power and targeting Sarah out of a warped sense of rejection following the dinner party fiasco. Shona attempted to restrain him, but the Platt family was instantly thrown into a state of total warfare, with David vowing to tear the police department apart to prove his sister's innocence. Across the street, the reaction was a mixture of horror and profound relief. For Todd Grimshaw, who had spent over a year drowning in the suspicion of killing his abuser, the revelation that his best friend had killed Theo to save him was a bittersweet, emotionally paralyzing truth. Summer Spellman, still carrying the trauma of her own wrongful arrest, could only watch in stunned silence as the real culprit was finally driven away toward the station. The epicenter of the fallout, however, quickly shifted to Gary Windass and Maria Connor. With Sarah in custody, Gary knew it was only a matter of time before his own role in the cover-up was exposed. Maria's previous suspicions of an affair evaporated, replaced by a cold, petrifying terror as she realized her husband had helped conceal a homicide. The arguments within their flat were raw and devastating, with Maria demanding to know how Gary could risk their entire life, their family, and their stability to protect his ex-girlfriend. Gary's defense, that he did it to keep the mother of his son out of prison, carried little weight with a wife who felt utterly betrayed by a year of profound lies. Meanwhile, down at the station, the interrogation room became a psychological battlefield. Kit sat across from Sarah, torn between his lingering affection for her and his duty as an officer of the law. As the tape rolled, Sarah finally unburdened herself, her voice cracking as she recounted the sheer terror of that night, the threats Theo had made, and the desperate, split-second decision that had changed everything. The tragedy of the situation hung heavily in the air. Sarah had acted in what she believed was self-defense, but her choice to hide the truth, manipulate the investigation, and allow Gary to obstruct justice had transformed a tragic accident into a definitive criminal conviction, leaving the future of the Platt family forever altered.